Shakespeare said, "Whate'er thou art, act well thy part." Now, he's assuming that each of us know who we are, and when we do, we can act our part well. He's referring to the act of following truth. Quentin L. Cook said, "Act in accordance with your true beliefs by spending your time on those things which will build and develop your character and help you become more Christ-like. I hope none of you see life as primarily fun and games, but rather as a time to prepare to meet God." Your education is part of that preparation. And this is going to be a Mantic and Suffolk review. We've already discussed a little bit about that, but to know the Mantic and the Sophic is a foundational principle in your education for that preparation. The Mantic, again, they're the ones that rely on God. Hugh Nibley said, "The Greek word mantic simply means prophetic or inspired, oracular," which that actually means handed down by the oral tradition. He continues, "coming from the other world and not from the resources of the human mind." The Mantic is actually a vertical Judaism, which you can imagine. Vertical is a line that goes from the floor to the ceiling, right? Or outside the grass to the heavens. So this vertical Judaism is a belief that there is a communication between you and between God, and between God and the prophets here on earth. Nibley said, "The belief in the real and present operation of divine gifts by which one receives constant guidance from the other world." And he's referring to that vertical Judaism. The Mantic accepts the other world, or better, other worlds, as part of their whole experience, without which any true understanding of this life is out of the question. It is the Mantic which supplies the element hope in our lives by assuring us of the reality of things beyond. Now, the substance of the Mantic is that there's a pre-existence, a present existence, and a future existence. And you're going to see that right off when we read Homer. And you're going to sense it as we read some Plato and Aristotle. Now, without that substance, the Greek life really lost its meaning. Do you remember in the part 1 where we talked about Hugh Nibley's experience reading the mythology of the Norse gods, that there was no hope in it, that every god expected evil to overcome them? Well, the Norse gods did not have the pre-existence or the future existence. They just had the present existence. And so you can see that without that substance, really, the Greek people will also lose their meaning, and they'll lose their hope. Now, there's substance of the Orphic mysteries, and that's just basically the story of Orpheus, which was one of the gods who had gone down to the underworld to save his wife. And I don't have a lot of time to go into that whole story, but he teaches these mysteries to people who go out and seek him. And he talks about the creation and the pre-existence, or in other words, the genesis of the gods, like how they came to be. He talks about the cosmos, which is the whole universe, and the stars and the planets. And he talks about men in this creation and pre-existence. He also talks about the fall of man and its necessary retribution. Excuse me. And we know that as the retribution as the atonement of Jesus Christ. And he talks about the ultimate destiny and goal of man. Now, these three things are readily recognized as the three great eschatological themes of the past, present, and future. Eschatology just means it's the study of the ends, like where we're going, what we're doing here, where have we been. That's the eschatology. It's just the study of the ends, the beginnings and the ends. So these things readily help us recognize these three things of past, present, and future so clearly set forth in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Now, we're not going to read any of the Egyptians, but you need to realize that they also had gods and that they had great works that talked about these three things: the creation, the fall, and basically the atonement or the retribution. Now let's go to the Sophics, which is a pulling away from God. The word Sophic is really a rare use of a word. It used to be that they were called the Sophists, Sophist. But soon after, the use of the word sophist became synonymous to rhetoric or rhetorical. So Hugh Nibley uses the word Sophic to differentiate between the rhetoric that the orators used and the actual pulling away from God. So we're going to use Sophic in this whole year as we talk about the Mantic and the Suffolk. Okay, the Sophics boast their cool, critical, objective, naturalistic, and scientific attitude. They believe in this horizontal Judaism. Do you remember how the Mantics use this vertical Judaism, that there's this line going from man to God and God to man? Well, the Sophics use a horizontal Judaism, which is synonymous with scholarly, bookish, halakhic, intellectual, and rabbinical. I want to stop there for a minute as we talk about the rabbis. You know that the last book of the Old Testament is Malachi, and he lived about the same time as Lehi, so about 600 years before Jesus Christ came to earth. And then there's no other books that have been written in the Old Testament until the New Testament, which is when Christ comes. And we know that the rabbis started to focus very sophically on the rules and the laws in the law of Moses. And so by the time we get to the New Testament time period, we see the Pharisees and the Sadducees who are so stuck on rules of the law of Moses that they can't see who God is, and they reject Christ. So going back to this horizontal Judaism, which is scholarly and bookish and halakhic and intellectual, it's also rabbinical. So it pulls people away from that vertical line from man to God and God to man, and has people focus on rules and man's knowledge. Okay? So the Sophic, this is also very important. The Sophic feeds off of ridiculing the Mantic. They feed off of that. They love going right straight to the foundation of the Mantic and just ridiculing and persecuting. Now the Sophic philosophy is basically what is accepted in universities and has been since the very beginning of the universities. And I think I talked about this in part 1 of the Mantic and Suffolk, that in the 1200s we see a lot of really intelligent men walking around reading the works of Aristotle and Plato and many of the great Greek works and studying them and looking for philosophy. And they begin Oxford University. They begin the great universities that we have sent many people to get their education. And so the Sophic model is very accepted in universities. Now I want to pause here for a second. I don't want you to think that studying the Sophics is bad. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that at the end of this discussion. Albert Leon Gerard said, "No man of unquestioning faith can be a member in good standing of a true university. A man who is not prepared to challenge, earnestly, respectfully, and fearlessly, the wealth of nations, or Das Kapital, the Quran, or the Book of Mormon, is at heart no scholar and no scientist." So here Albert Gerard is saying that you're basically not a scholar or a scientist unless you can challenge these books, the Wealth of Nation, Das Kapital, the Quran, or the Book of Mormon. You've got to be able to challenge them. And I want you to note that challenging things means to reject them outright. And Hugh Nibley goes quite deeply when he talks about how when people are challenging truths, they're actually rejecting them. You can actually challenge something by looking for the truth in them. But when you reject the truth and you just look for the things that look like faults in things, you challenge those faults and you don't look for the truth, then you are actually doubting truth and putting a lot of faith in false things. So that's what he means by that. Or that's what I'm explaining what challenging means. And then Gerard says that you're not going to be a scholar or a scientist if you pretty much don't reject these things. Okay, so my question is, can Mantic and Sophic be combined? Nibley says, it is when one seeks to combine or reconcile the Sophic and the Mantic that trouble begins. And what he means by that is when you try to take the attitude of the Mantic and the attitude of the Sophic, where you love God and you hate God, and you try and combine that, you can't. Empedocles of 494 BC said, true reason is either divine or human. The former is not for discussion. The latter is discussion. So the Sophics really don't think they can be combined. And Empedocles is basically saying that true reason, so the divine reason is not for discussion, and human reason is for discussion. So he's a Sophic, and he's saying you can't put those two things together. And I beg to differ, but we're going to talk about that at the end of this discussion. Let's see, Charles Kahn said of Empedocles, he said, Empedocles is argued to be two distinct thinkers. He's a Sophic and a Mantic. Quote, a split personality whose two sections are not united by any essential link. So whoever accepts the Sophic attitude must abandon the Mantic and vice versa. And we're talking about attitude, right? We're talking about attitude. The Greeks and the Orientals and the Christians always talked about that there's a two ways doctrine. The Christians say that there's you can choose God or choose mammon. And the Orientals and the Greeks say you can choose evil or you can choose good. And let's see. And they say that if you try to compromise between them, you get nowhere because, as one of the apostolic fathers points out, they lead in opposite directions. Now beware that attitude is different than seeking and studying. So what I'm talking about here is that if you have an attitude of following God and an attitude of not following God or following the adversary, you can't combine those two. Those are attitudes. But you can be a Mantic and study the Sophic works and the Sophic ideas. You can seek and study those, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a future slide. So becoming a Mantic is actually a choice, and it's dependent upon individual agency. Once you're on the Sophic side, it's pretty difficult to come back because the adversary has a hold on you. Franklin Balmer said, "Modern man is the heir of the skeptical tradition. In the present epoch, a large and increasing number of Europeans have expressed the desire to return to the religious tradition. Whenever they take it into their head to return, the shades of all the great skeptics," and when he talks about the shades, he's talking about, and we're going to see this in Homer, when we read the Odyssey, the shades are the ghosts, okay? So he says, whenever they take it into their head to return, the shades of all the great skeptics, Pierre Baal and Voltaire, Ernest Renan, and Sigmund Freud, and the rest, rise up around them and persuade them with considerable success that they cannot go back. You know, maybe they cannot go back because they were never there. I'm talking about the Europeans now, because he's up there in that quote. He's talking about the Europeans, and their religion has actually been Sophic since shortly after the meridian of time. So for hundreds of years, they have had this Sophic religion. So maybe they've never been there. But if they cannot return, they can at least turn. And so can you and I. Zeezrom turned toward God. He was an ancient American lawyer in the Book of Mormon. He was educated in the Hebrew law or law of Moses, and he sought to destroy the liberty of the Nephites through his legal practice. He tried to bribe Alma to denounce God and convince the people of Ammonihah that Alma and Amulek were wicked. After debating with them, he was confounded and lost the argument. Eventually, he became convinced of his misdeeds and repented of his sins. And he fell sick and called for them to give him a blessing of health. And he later left his practice of law and became a missionary with Alma, Amulek, and others. He turned to God. It's a choice. The fictitious character of Jean Valjean turned toward God. Jane Eyre turned toward God. The Apostle Paul, who once was known as the Jew killer Saul, turned toward God and never went back to his Sophic state. It is never too late to turn toward God. It is through God that we receive the truth through revelation and through the Spirit. Pierre Noir, who's the author of Human Destiny, wrote, "God grant that we are mistaken, but if we have read the signs of the times correctly, the only salvation for mankind will be found in religion." Pierre Noir was a scientist and a philosopher. Plato and Aristotle, after mastering the Sophic in their youth, why is it that youth fall on the path of the Sophic so often? Both of them, both Plato and Aristotle, after they had mastered the Sophic in their youth, had turned wholeheartedly to the Mantic quest. Now my question is, can one be a Mantic and study the Sophic works? A resounding yes. Here is where we can mesh the Mantic and the Sophic together. The clincher is that a Mantic must be a believer before he sets foot into the Sophic writings. Nibley says, "The true seeker of truth seeks everywhere. He is a true scientist, but to search he must be a believer. For even in the lab, ye receive no witness until after the trial of your faith." He quotes Ether 12:6 there. And then he continues, it is perfectly proper to believe and seek. Those who have faith and hope, and to labor to be worthy of receiving revelation. Nibley continues, it becomes us as saints of the Most High to inform and become informed, and to treasure up knowledge and wisdom concerning all things. And you remember that scripture in Doctrine and Covenants, 78 through I'm going to say maybe 82 or so, where it talks about how we are to become informed and educated in all the academics, everything. It talks about everything in the sky, under the earth, the things overseas. It just talks about all of the things that we're to study. And so it's really interesting that we are to treasure up the knowledge and wisdom concerning all things. Joseph Fielding Smith said, there is nothing more important in the lives of members of the church than to have the gift of knowledge. And this does not come by observation, but by constant study and faith. And that's what I ask you to have this whole year, is that you have that ability and desire to study through faith. You and I are actors in a world filled with truth and error. It is our responsibility to seek, learn, and to know the truth amidst the error. Now, as you journey through this coming year studying the Greeks, you will face many forks in the road to wisdom. Which one will be the truth? How will you know? Well, the Mantic knows. He looks to personal revelation and finds it. He acts on it. He acts on it in this life play called the second act. He knows he came from God in the first act, and that he will return to God in Act 3. May you find the key to truth and unlock the mysteries of God.